Committed to creating and sharing knowledge that empowers children and young people to understand the steps they can take to reduce their risks, increase their resilience to mental health problems, and improve their mental health.
Our vision is to create a world with a sound mental health for all.
People do attempt suicide.
Naturally, people are born to judge. But judging and expressing the judgment is something that we can reserve for ourselves.
We find that suicide bereavement is even more difficult than losing someone through natural death.
Be empathetic in the way you approach their situation, because if you show too much sympathy, they will also start feeling guilty.
Greetings to you all. Welcome to our show, Tap In.
I think the main factor that leads somebody to finally complete suicide, from my experience with over 500 people who have attempted suicide, is that the first thing is the suicide ideation itself. Just when someone has a suicide thought, the suicide ideation itself can be a big driver to make someone start to think of, okay, what can I use to die? When would I want to die? How am I going to want to die?
It's unfortunate that people are not able to pick these warning signs, but it has been shown that up to 70% of people give out some sort of warning. So we want to look at these warning signs, these warning behaviors that people portray, and that then lead them to committing suicide or attempting suicide.
So the suicide ideation is a driver, but then we go backwards and say, what is causing that person to have the suicide ideation? Because when I was doing my research with the people who attempted suicide, I noticed that all of them, the thought itself is something that is very, very paramount in each one of them. And then what is causing the thought, even if the little one thinks I want to die, this 15-year-old boy is like, I want to die, from nowhere. It doesn't come from nowhere. So there are factors now that can actually make people vulnerable. One of the biggest factor was suffering. When someone is going through some suffering, emotional suffering, psychological suffering, and nobody wants to suffer, especially pain. If there is some kind of pain, something is going on, maybe a lot of ill treatment, a lot of physical abuse, a lot of sexual abuse, a lot of emotional abuse, and it's just hitting you every day. That pain alone can make someone feel hopeless, helpless, feel stuck. They don't know what to do. The pain is so unbearable. They can't carry it. It's like a heavy thing. So as a result of that, a person would want to run away from the pain.
Let's say you feel that you are depressed, you are failing to cope. First thing that you need to do is to seek help. So each time that you feel that you are not coping with your problems, look for someone to talk to.
When we're talking about culture, we're talking about the customs, the practices, the beliefs that we hold as a people. And if you look at the African context, or you're looking within Zimbabwe in particular, there are certain beliefs and certain ways of being that we have as a people that you might find pushing young people especially towards suicide. Parents put a certain amount of pressure for one to perform. And in instances like that, you find that this is where people end up committing suicide because they failed a module, or they're failing to move on in their studies, or their studies have been halted for whatever reason. And people end up thinking, well, I've been such a disappointment. The only thing to do is for me to take my life.
Greetings to you all. Welcome to our show, Tap In. My name is Tawanda Mrepa, and I'm the director and founder of Young People Mental Health Trust. Today, we will talk about why do people commit suicide, and we have our guest, Dr. Shamiso Madzivire and Reverend Shumba. Welcome to our show, Reverend Shumba.
Good afternoon to you. How are you?
I'm fine. Can you introduce yourself?
My name is Tinevimbo Shumba from Midland State University. I am the university counselor. Will be presenting on depression and other mental illness, as well as suicide. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Madzivire. I am a sociology lecturer and the acting chairperson of the department at Midland State University. And I will be sharing a little bit today on the impact that culture has as far as dealing with issues of depression and suicide.
Okay, thank you all. Welcome to our show. So to start our show, why do people commit suicide? So this question will be directed to to Reverend Tinevimbo. Can you highlight issues to deal with depression and other mental illness when it comes to suicide and how to cope?
For your question, from what I'm hearing is threefold. The first question was on why people commit suicide, if I heard you very well. To answer your question on why people commit suicide, it's very difficult to tell why people commit suicide, but because there are several reasons why people commit suicide. But I will answer your question relating it to depression, because that's my presentation. People are bombarded every day with situations that they are failing to cope with, situations that are very difficult, situations that push them to their extremes. And if they fail to seek help, if they fail to find someone to talk to in time, many times we see people when they are pushed to their extremes, committing suicide. There are several reasons why people commit suicide besides depression. It could be possibly they have failed naturally to cope with life in general. It could also be that there are different community challenges that they are likely to be facing, or cultural challenges that they are likely to be facing that result in them committing suicide. Or it could be they didn't get someone to talk to. Talking to someone, talking naturally is therapeutic. It could be each time that they tried to reach out to someone, everyone will be closing them out. And as a result, they feel that they are alone, they are pushed down the tunnel, and they can't breathe and they can't actually help themselves. Those are my inputs on why people commit suicide.
Okay, so can you also highlight on issues to do with how to copy from what you have said? Can you also explain how to copy?
Very much. For coping mechanism, let's say you feel that you are depressed, you are failing to cope, or you are failing to cope with the depression. The first thing that you need to do is to seek help. If you can't help, stop and seek help. Help can come from either your friends, either your community members, or even from the hospital. So each time that you feel that you are not coping with your problems, look for someone to talk to. That's the first instance. And then you can also engage yourself in self-help exercise. This self-help exercise could be through the way you control your thinking processes. Let's say, for example, you feel that the problems are overwhelming, take your problems as a challenge that you can deal with, that you can attend to, that you can find different facets to look at. Many times in life in general, when we look at problems, we see them as a disaster or as the end of you. But if you give yourself time and look at a problem and say, let's say I can look it at A or at using B or using C, you will see that you have several alternatives that you can use to address the problems that are challenging you. And then thirdly, the other coping mechanism that you can use is to find something to do that is physical, that helps you to release the tension. Normally, what makes us get worse is the tension that builds up over time. So if we give ourselves to look for something, for example, let's say to go and dig outside or to go and exercise, you will feel the tension releasing. You will feel so much relieved. And then something that I found interesting is to keep myself in the company of friends or in the company of family or significant others each time that I feel that I'm depressed. This has helped me in many ways because they will listen to my story, they know me better, they're able even to challenge some of the negative thoughts that I might be having. I think these 4 criteria, I have found them helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for highlighting that out. And also during our WhatsApp presentation, we also highlighted issues to do with fear or loss of fear. Someone might end up actually committing suicide because they might, developing some sort of fear regarding to the issues to do with uncertainty and issues to do fear of maybe failing to school. And also there's the issue of hopelessness, whereby someone actually don't have hope about tomorrow, and then they end up committing suicide. So now, Dr. Mazire, can you highlight more on culture and suicide? What does culture play and issues to do with suicide?
Thank you. So when we're talking about culture, we're talking about the customs, the practices, the beliefs that we hold as a people. And if you look at the African context, or you're looking within Zimbabwe in particular, there are certain beliefs and certain ways of being that we have as a people that you might find pushing young people especially towards suicide. So for example, we value education a lot. We see it as something important. One has to go to primary school, you go to high school, and then you go to university. And a lot of times, parents put a certain amount of pressure for one to perform. And in instances like that, you find that this is where people end up committing suicide because they failed a module, or they're failing to move on in their studies, or their studies have been halted for whatever reason. And people end up thinking, well, I've been such a disappointment. The only thing to do is for me to take my life. We also have instances where, the expectations that are placed on us by our parents, not just where education is concerned, but even for young women, for example, the issue of purity. We hear a lot about having hunu, hunu. And the way that that's crafted, especially around sexuality is concerned for young people in the country, is you have to make sure you keep yourself pure, you're not engaging in sex before you're married. And so in cases where, for example, a young woman now falls pregnant, there is all that pressure that then comes down on you because of this notion of hunu and expectations of how you're supposed to behave. And in that sense, they can then push one to think suicide is the only option. And we actually have lots of instances in the country where we've seen on the news, or we've seen in newspapers, stories of girls who jump off train tracks. That was one case. Or drink poison or things like that, because they're trying to get rid of this pregnancy, and they leave a suicide note saying, I'm such a disappointment. I went and I did this. What is society going to think? What are you as my family going to think about me? And so those are the things that we really need to tackle. We need to open up communication channels in our families and start having these very difficult discussions around expectations, around mental health issues in general. Because as a people as well, we don't like to acknowledge that mental illness exists. If you hear the word mental illness being used in our culture, people equate it to kupenga. And yet there's so many different aspects of that. There are things like anxiety, there are things like depression, and we don't talk about that. We don't want to acknowledge it. We tend to brush it under the carpet, and these are some of the problems that we actually have.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Doc, for highlighting those issues. And so now, as the community, what do you need to do now to make sure that we change the way that we actually give pressure to our young people, or maybe give pressure to we set some norms actually that may actually have a lot of pressure to a person. So as a society now, what do we need to do in terms of raising awareness? What should we start, and where should we start?
It's a bit difficult to say where do we start, but I will give a few ideas that I have on the matter. So the first one is communication. We definitely need open communication around these issues. Parents need to create a sort of safe environment where a young person can come and say, listen, this is what I'm experiencing. I'd like to talk about it. I'd like to get help. Because we're so afraid to approach parental figures to talk about things. So we need to create that openness between our caregivers and the young people as well. The other thing that we need to do is to embrace differences. Because I personally believe that not everyone is supposed to, for example, go through tertiary education. There are a lot of people who have other talents, other skills, but because of parents and the idea that they have, that the only way for you to prosper is if you go to university and get a job. And we need to change our thinking around that. We need to embrace the differences of our young people. We need to embrace their talents and allow them to explore outside of the conventional spaces that we have. The other thing that we could possibly work on as well is starting to reframe, talk about the issue of sexuality. So with that in particular in mind, we need to reframe the way that we talk about such issues. So as parents, they need to step up and start talking about these issues openly again. So communication with their children, where it's a case, Yakuti, if someone falls pregnant, their first thought is not going to be, let me go and commit suicide, or let me go and try and get rid of this baby. Their first thought can be, oh, actually, me and my parents had a little discussion around this. Let me approach them and tell them, Guti, I made a mistake, there's a problem, how can we deal with it? So those are some of the things that I think we can start to do, but definitely at the foundation of it all is a solid communication structure.
Okay, okay. Thank you so much for raising that issue. Communication is important. We need to communicate. We need to embrace the communication structure. Our society should listen some of the things so that the kids out there can easily approach their parents or maybe their guidance. Back to you, Ref Shumba. There is also an issue to do with genetics. Can you explain further? We heard some people, they're saying if someone commits suicide in the family, there is a probability that someone will commit suicide again. So what is your view on that one?
I was saying I didn't quite get your first part of the question.
Okay, I was talking about the issue to do with genetics. In the family, we have someone commit suicide maybe last year. People actually said there's a probability that someone will commit suicide in the near future. So what is your take? Do you agree with that notion or you disagree?
I agree, because we have had instances whereby one, for example, a parent commits suicide, and then within the same context of the family, we see someone again committing suicide. And as we go through the research that has been carried out, there is evidence to suggest that some of the reported suicidal cases are as a result of genetics. So genetics, yes, they actually contribute to suicide. If someone in your family has committed suicide, the chances of you committing suicide are higher than someone who doesn't have a family member or a sibling who has committed suicide. Thank you, Tawanda.
Okay, thank you so much, Ref Shumba, and thank you so much again, Dr. Mazivire, for having us today on this show. If you have something to add on culture, culture is a bit, actually, there's a lot of things that needs to be done, especially on our culture issues to deal with how we actually treat the bereaved family regarding suicide issues, and also how we also view the one who actually commit suicide. Our culture is actually, I don't know, we can't say we are lacking, I don't know, but there's something that needs to be done, that needs to be changed.
Thanks. I think there are a lot of misconceptions as far as the issue of suicide is concerned, which is one of the big problems. We view suicide as something that is taboo. We view it as maybe someone was selfish, and so we shouldn't really go out of our way to pay respect to that person. But in actual fact, people need to be, I guess, conscientized on the issue of depression and have them trying to understand of what exactly is it that is going through the mind of someone who is suicidal, or someone who has been suicidal at one point or another in their lives. I think if we can get people to be more sensitive around that, that would definitely be quite beneficial, and we'll find ourselves moving towards a space where we don't step back and start to stigmatize against people who've actually attempted suicide. In the event that they attempt suicide and they fail, you will find that in some cases in communities, there's a lot of stigma around that. There's a lot of tongues wagging, people pointing fingers, and that's also something that needs to stop. We need to recognize it as what it truly is, which is a cry for help. And we need to think of depression not in the case of you're making these things up. It's all in your head. We need to move away from thinking of it like that, and actually taking into consideration the fact that there are things like hormonal imbalance that lead to depression and anxiety. So it's actually a biological illness. And I think if we can start looking at it as that, the way that we view suicide or suicide attempts, we might view it with a little bit more compassion, because it's not so simple. But in as far as culture changing, changes don't happen overnight. We can't just wake up and say, tomorrow we're changing the way that we view things as a people. It's actually a gradual process that happens over time, one person at a time. So if it can even start with us young people, teaching our peers, teaching our children when we have children, making sure they're aware of issues around mental illness and have a better understanding than we had growing up or than previous generations growing up, then that would definitely be a great starting point.
Thank you for highlighting that issues. To our viewers out there, we are still under COVID-19. So we actually doing this online initiative to make sure that everyone is safe, and we'll be doing the physical talk show when COVID-19 is actually over. So stay safe, pay attention to regulations. Stay safe. Let us protect our loved ones. So again, once again, thank you, Dr. Madzivire, and thank you, Reverend Shumba, for having us on this show. I think we are actually closing. We will meet again next week. Thank you so much, Dr. Madzivire.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Reverend Shumba, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tawanda, for having me.
It's okay.
When someone is suicidal, it's very difficult to tell that the person is suicidal because a lot of us have got a judgmental approach to how things are or how people look at it. By its nature, suicide, for those people who commit suicide, they're basically there to punish the people that are left behind. So in most cases, they're looking for attention. So we need to be able to give an ear to listen and to pay attention to what details, what hints they put across for us to know.
Thank you, Zimbabwe, for joining us on our show. We will continue again next week. This is Check In. Check In next week.